Good afternoon. In this lecture, I'd like to talk about Susan Sontag's short story, The Way We Live Now. This was a story that was published in The New Yorker in 1986. Sontag, as you remember, wrote Illness as Metaphor, which we examined earlier this semester. And given that you already have some background information on Sontag from earlier work, I'd actually like to focus this lecture on the story itself. So, The Way We Live Now is a comment on the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, which was the period in time in which the AIDS epidemic was beginning to affect New York City's cultural elite. And I want to give you a little bit of background on the spread of AIDS in the US, particularly in the early 1980s. Because what this story is doing is really capturing an early moment in the long history of HIV and AIDS in the United States. So we first see a mention of AIDS in a CDC report in 1981, noting at that time that it's a rare form of cancer among gay men living in Los Angeles. After this, cases of what we now recognize as AIDS become much more prevalent in the US. But at this point in the early 1980s, the prevalence of the disease in the US is largely confined to homosexual communities and drug using communities within coastal cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. By 1983, the CDC had clarified the routes of transmission for AIDS, noting in particular that AIDS could not be transmitted through casual contact, which was a first part of early education efforts about the AIDS epidemic. By 1986, which is the year in which Sontag's story is published, the cause of AIDS had been identified as HIV. Congress had begun to allocate money for AIDS research, and at least one hospital in California had opened up a ward specifically to treat patients with AIDS. But the disease at this moment in time is really not all that well known, nor is there any kind of robust treatment like what we have now. So, a few things to note about the story. The story is actually structured around fragments of conversation taking place among a group of friends about a member of their friend group who's sick and in the hospital. The friend at the center of the story never actually speaks, nor is he really a kind of fleshed out character like the characters we've seen in other stories, such as The Fault in Our Stars. Moreover, his friends actually never mention that he has either HIV or AIDS, but they allude to it constantly. So, what we're left with then is a character and a set of events that's narrated ultimately through gossip, through little bits of conversation. So, here's a few ways in which we can think about this story given those facts. Um, One is that this unnamed sick friend strikes me as more of an occasion than a character because his friends use his illness as a jumping off point for gossip, prognostications, bickering, and commentary about their knowledge of the disease, their knowledge of treatments, and their opinions about the medical establishment's reaction and response to the disease. And his illness also provides an occasion for them then to think about their role as a support community for this friend. By that, I mean that they all seem to be working through how it is that they can be a friend to someone who is really acutely ill with this disease that they see rippling through their friend group. And ultimately, then he provides a means for them to think about, their own vulnerability to disease as well. So that leaves me with a question that I'd love to debate in our discussion board, which is why does Sontag choose to narrate this story through fragments of other people's conversations? How does this allow her to comment on the AIDS epidemic? I'd love to take up this discussion further, and we'll look forward to talking with you in the discussion board. Thank you.